Hello, everyone. My name is Dale Bond. I'm Director of Research Integration at Hartford Hospital in Connecticut, USA, where I work with our Hartford Hospital Surgical and Weight Loss Program. I am also Chair of the IFSO Integrated Health Research and Innovation Committee. And today I'm pleased to welcome you to all of you to the inaugural IFSO Integrated Health Research and Innovation Committee sponsored webinar. And the title of today's webinar is Tips for Writing an Effective and Impactful Structured Scientific Abstract, which we felt would be helpful to all of you in preparing and submitting abstracts of your best work to the upcoming IFSO Congress in Melbourne. I am accompanied by two excellent scientist presenters who I am also pleased to recognize as my colleagues. Our first is Dr. David Sarwer. He's the Senior Associate Dean for Research and Strategic Partnerships and the Director of the Center for Obesity Research and Education at the Temple University College of Public Health in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Much of Dr. Sarwer's long, successful, and distinguished research career is focused on the psychosocial and behavioral aspects of extreme obesity and metabolic and bariatric surgery. He has obtained several grants from the National Institutes of Health pursuant to this focus. He's also one of the most oft-cited researchers in this space. He also serves as the founding editor-in-chief of Obesity Science and Practice and is associate editor for obesity surgery. Our second presenter is Dr. Louisa Herring, who is the lead research associate for physical activity research and implementation at the Leicester Diabetes Center within Leicester Biomedical Research Center's Lifestyle Health and Research Group. She researches in the area of physical activity and multiple long-term conditions, particularly in the context of obesity and metabolic and bariatric surgery. She also leads the translation of physical activity research into implementable tools and pathways for people living with or at risk of these conditions. She has undertaken multiple trials to increase activity and/or improve fitness in individuals living with obesity. And most recently, she has focused on the 24-hour movement behaviors concept and utilizing technology to measure, monitor, and promote these behaviors. So in terms of our webinar, Dr. Sarwer will first present on abstract writing 101, and then Dr. Herring will follow up with her presentation on abstract top tips, the practical application. And during her talk, she'll provide clear examples of how she applies Dr. Sarwer's recommendations in one of her abstracts. After this, we'll open it up to questions from all of you. Just to let you know, you can type your questions into the question and answer field at the bottom of your screen at any time. Also, just a reminder that this webinar will be recorded and will be available tomorrow on IFSO Virtual Academy and the IFSO YouTube channel. And so with that, let's start with Dr. Sarwer.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. David Sarwer. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Research and Strategic Partnerships and Professor of Social Behavioral Sciences and Director of the Center for Obesity Research and Education at the College of Public Health at Temple University in Philadelphia in the United States. And I'm also a very proud member of the Integrated Health Committee of IFSO. And it's my great pleasure to spend a little bit of time with you today sharing my thoughts about abstract writing 101 and how to write an effective, compelling abstract that really holds the reviewer's attention, communicates the important, impactful work that you've done, and most importantly, gets you to Melbourne, Australia in the fall, where we're on track to have a really outstanding meeting. So with that, I'm going to go right into my presentation, and I do want to thank my colleague and friend, Dr. Dale Bond, for inviting me to participate. And hopefully, if Louisa and I do our jobs correctly, you will come away from this session with a really good understanding of how to write that compelling, engaging abstract. So one of the things I want to do right off the top is direct you to the abstract submission guidelines and submission site. They are all here on this website that you can see right here. And the call for abstracts will close in a few weeks. So you've got about 2.5 to 3 weeks, maybe a little bit more than that now I think about it, to go ahead and get your abstracts in. And everything that you need to organize your abstract, to format your abstract correctly, is on that website. So I really encourage you to go to the website, read through it, read through the multiple pages of instructions, and be prepared to upload as efficiently as possible. So I really encourage you to read through those submission guidelines. They've been put together very thoughtfully, and I'm going to highlight some of them for you in just a moment. all of our submissions have to be made through the online portal. So you can't send them directly to the IFSO office in Naples. You can't ask, your local IFSO rep to handle them for you. You've got to go ahead and submit them directly. And I think it's really important in this day and age that you ensure that all of your authors and presenters, everybody on your team who you've putting their name on the abstract, are aware that you're submitting that abstract and have approved of you doing so. Because believe it or not, every year or two, an issue comes up where we find out that somebody's name is on something and they didn't approve it and they don't agree with what's being presented. And it really creates an unfortunate set of circumstances for the organizers of the meeting. Now, there's a big table in these guidelines about the IFSO accepted nomenclature for our abstracts. And I want to highlight a few things for you because at the last several meetings that I've been to, unfortunately, there are still too many presentations, too many posters where we are making errors in our language that unfortunately are stigmatizing the patients that we're also very dedicated to helping. So first and foremost, it's critically important that we all get in the habit of using first-person language, that we shouldn't use the term obese as an adjective or a noun to describe an individual person or even a group. Instead, we should use terms like people with obesity or populations with obesity. Please use severe obesity or make reference to a BMI range or class, but not terms like morbid obesity, super obesity, or extreme obesity, and all of its derivations. As somebody who's used extreme obesity in the past, I still have to remind myself not to do that. But I heard a presentation earlier this week where somebody unfortunately used morbid obesity. And that's really a term that we need to strike from our language as quickly as possible. It's also really important that we do not use terms such as success or failure after an operation or intervention. We don't use the term recidivism, which is often, at least its English derivation, is referenced and used in reference to crime. That we don't talk about non-compliance because we all know that regardless of the strength of metabolic and bariatric surgery, that it can be very challenging for people in our food environment to engage in those behaviors that we try to promote. We don't use terms like gold standard or last resort either. And also, as many of you are aware, we're moving to a new terminology. We're moving away from calling it bariatric surgery or weight loss surgery, and we really should be using the preferred term by IFSO, which is bariatric-metabolic surgery. So again, just to give you some selected examples, the old term that we shouldn't be using on the left, morbid obesity, please use something like severe obesity instead. Instead of subjects, use patients or individuals. Better yet, in a research study, use participants. Instead of weight loss surgery, use metabolic bariatric surgery with the abbreviation MBS. Inadequate weight loss can be replaced with suboptimal clinical response. And weight regain should be replaced with recurrent weight regain. And a lot of the work that I do is in the space where people regain their weight after surgery. So again, I have to remind myself regularly to use the most appropriate and contemporary terms. Now, in terms of the abstract format, there are 5 main recommended sections: the background, the objectives, the methods, the results, and the conclusion. In total, our submission should be no longer than 350 words, but that excludes both the title as well as other contact details. And do not bother to include references in the body of the abstract. You can put those into your poster, you can put them at the end of your oral presentation, but they do not need to be in the abstract, which will actually save space for you. Now, there are 3 main presentation types. There are oral presentations, otherwise known as podium presentations. There are e-posters, and there also are videos. And for those of us on the integrated health side of the street, primarily we're probably looking at oral presentations or e-posters, although I have heard that there may be a video in one of the integrated health sessions that will be particularly informative around the issues of stigma and bias. And in terms of the multidisciplinary topics that we can touch upon, there's a list of all of the surgical topics, but these are really the multidisciplinary topics of great interest to the society at this time. So integrated care, the use of pharmacotherapy, nutritional issues before and after bariatric surgery, metabolic and bariatric surgery, psychological and behavioral health issues, physical activity and sedentary behavior, managing pregnancy, as well as issues around anti-aging and wellness, are really the categories and topics of greatest interest this year. In terms of titling your abstract or your presentation, you should enter the full title, but that title should be as brief as possible, but long enough to clearly reflect the nature of your abstract. This title may appear in all Congress information, including print, website, apps, and social media, and that capital letters should only be used at the beginning of the title for a proper noun or after a colon. I would suggest not making that title too general nor too specific, but also realize that many of your reviewers may come from a variety of disciplines. And so it's really important that we don't use too much jargon that may be only known and understood by a small subset of individuals. So one example, and this actually comes from a manuscript of mine recently published in Obesity Surgery, Changes in Eating Behavior and the Relation to Weight Change 6 and 12 months after bariatric metabolic surgery. The study is actually much more complex than that, but in terms of the abstract and the title, I don't want to overwhelm the reader with too much detail. In terms of formatting the background, I suggest that you use 2 to 3 sentences which make the case for the importance of your study. There's no need to tell the reader what he or she already knows. We all know that obesity is a significant public health issue. We all know that obesity is bad and that metabolic and bariatric surgery can be good. So an example could be something that you see here: identifying eating behaviors associated with suboptimal weight loss following metabolic bariatric surgery remains important. The study assessed the relationship between preoperative eating behaviors and weight loss in the first post-operative year in a large racially diverse sample. And as you can see, in 2 sentences and only 37 words, I've given you a good sense of what this study is going to be all about. You also have an opportunity to articulate the objectives. So you have 1 or 2 sentences to talk about what was the study designed to do. And you can see an example here where I detail both the first objective as well as a secondary objective and used 45 words to do that. Don't feel obligated to explain every nuance and every detail and every analysis that you did. That's what the presentation or the poster is for. In the abstract, you just want to give your reviewer and your reader a high-level understanding of what the study is all about. In terms of the methods, I would suggest using 1 and maybe 2 sentences detailing the physical and or behavioral assessments involved, and then 1 sentence reserved for the statistical analyses. So here you could see I've used 2 sentences where I've talked about the assessment methods we've used, both an interview as well as validated measures assessing a range of eating behaviors, but note that I didn't name all of them to save space. And then the last sentence of this section talks about the statistical analytic plan that we used in this study. So linear mixed effects models were used to test the impact of eating behaviors on percent weight loss at 6 and 12 months. In terms of the results section, this is really where the bulk of your words, the majority of that 350 words is likely going to be used. And you could see in this example here, I've used 108 words. Now, for the purposes of this example in this presentation today, I've counted the numbers and the percentages as words. So even though they're in numeric form, they're counting as words, so they're counting against that 350. But you could see in about 4 sentences, I've explained all of the major findings from this study in a way that's concise and compelling and gives the reader something to understand what it was that we set out to do. And then in terms of conclusion, I think one big challenge is always to make sure that you're not just restating the results, but really talking about the implication of the work. So you can see here in 45 words, we've written, among a diverse participant sample, problematic eating behaviors following surgery were associated with a smaller percent weight loss over 12 months. Postoperative assessment and treatment of eating behaviors is needed to address these issues as they arise and to prevent the attenuation of early weight loss in some patients. So 45 words. And so if we sum it all up, you can see that I was able to write that abstract describing a large multi-year study where we followed patients for a year after surgery in 292 words. So I still had another 58 words that I could have thrown in there if I wanted to. But I think one good thing to keep in mind is that your reviewers are tired. They're likely doing this at the end of the day. They're not being compensated for this work. This is part of their service to the field and to the society. And so anything that you can do to make their jobs easier, even if that means your abstract is a little bit shorter, will be greatly appreciated. So in summary, here are some helpful hints for all of you. I encourage you to write in a simple and straightforward manner. Avoid jargon that may be lost on someone from another discipline or specialty within our field. Avoid the temptation of explaining every methodological detail. That can be really hard for researchers like me because we want to tell you all about our science, but save some of that story for the meeting itself. Save the secondary results or the exploratory analyses for the poster or presentation, but tie the conclusion to a clinical audience. Remember that so many of our attendees from around the world spend most of their time delivering high quality patient care. And so our research findings are important to inform that work, but we as researchers have that obligation to do it effectively. So be sure to put in that last sentence that ties the results of your work to clinical care. And leave the reviewer with an overall positive impression, something along the lines of, I want to hear that presentation in Melbourne. And with those strategies, I'm optimistic that you can write a really compelling, engaging abstract for the meeting coming up in September in Melbourne. I look forward to seeing you there.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be part of this webinar looking at the top tips for writing an effective, impactful, structured scientific abstract. I'm Dr. Louisa Herring. I'm the Lead Research Associate in Physical Activity Research and Implementation in our Leicester Lifestyle Health Research Group at the Leicester Diabetes Centre, based at the University Hospitals of Leicester in the United Kingdom. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Dale Bond for inviting me to present to you today the practical application of the abstract top tips that you've just heard in David's very informative presentation. Thank you very much, David. So firstly, I thought this was really interesting actually. A scientific abstract should contribute to the reader's most relevant aspects of each part of the whole manuscript, maintaining a balance between excessive detail and a vague contribution of information. This supports everything David was just saying, and it's something to bear in mind when you're writing your abstract. I'm going to break down an abstract into the specific sections and apply the tips that David has just provided us to each section individually. So starting with the title. As you heard, the title should be brief, but clearly reflect the topic area you are trying to present. So here's an example. The effects of supervised exercise training 12 to 24 months after metabolic bariatric surgery on physical function and body composition, a randomized control trial. So within this title, I have made sure that the capitals are in the places they should be. So a capital at the beginning and a capital after the colon. I have ensured that the title clearly reflects the topic area, supervised exercise training on individuals after metabolic bariatric surgery, on physical function and body composition. I have ensured I've avoided any jargon or any words that people wouldn't understand. And for the purpose of the IFSO abstract submission, included Times New Roman font. And I have also identified that this study is a randomized control trial. So next, thinking about background. As David has said, this should highlight the importance of the study without telling the reviewers what they already know about obesity. As you know, we all already know that obesity is a significant public health problem, so we don't need to tell everyone that. So here's an example background that I have developed for this study. Recurrent weight gain is increasingly evident 12 to 24 months after metabolic bariatric surgery. Recurrent weight gain increases the risk of physical function decline, which negatively affects an individual's ability to undertake activities of daily living. So, I have stuck to 2 sentences to highlight the importance of this study. I'm not telling the reader obesity-related information that they already know, and have made sure I am using the correct terminology. So I have to be very, very careful, because in previous research I have used the term weight regain, and now we should make sure that we're using recurrent weight gain. So I have made sure that within the background example I have included this terminology. And this background example I have here is a total of 37 words. Moving on to the objective or objectives. So we should articulate the main objective or objectives of the study, as David previously mentioned. So here's my example. To assess the effects of a 12-week supervised exercise intervention on physical function and body composition in patients between 12 and 24 months after metabolic bariatric surgery. So I have managed to put the objective into one sentence. It outlines the objective of the study, and I have ensured I've used the correct terminology. Metabolic bariatric surgery, for instance, and used patients or participants could be used in this instance. But the objective is a total of 25 words and is not outlining too much information. So next we look at the methods. As David said, the methods section sometimes can be quite long because everyone's trying to tell the reader everything about their methods. So you should try and summarize the key methodology. Here's the methodology example that I have included in this abstract. 24 adults whose body mass index remained over 30 and 12 to 24 months after metabolic bariatric surgery were randomized to an exercise intervention or control group. Supervised exercise consisted of 3 60-minute gym sessions per week of moderate intensity aerobic and resistance training for 12 weeks. Control participants received usual care. The incremental shuttle walk test assessed functional walking performance after the 12-week exercise intervention and at 24 weeks follow-up. Measurements of anthropometric, physical activity, cardiovascular and psychological outcomes were also examined. Independent t-tests were used to compare outcome measures between groups. So within the methodology section, I have spoken about the population, the randomized trial design. I have spoken about the intervention. That is only relevant if it's applicable to the study. I've mentioned the primary outcome measure and briefly touched on the other outcome measures, secondary outcome measures that it was used in this study, and briefly mentioned the statistical analysis. This totaled 94 words. Moving on to the results. So within the results section, you should clearly describe the most important findings of your study. So here's the example I have. Significant improvements in the exercise group were observed for the incremental shuttle walk test, body composition, physical function, cardiovascular and self-efficacy measures from baseline to 12 weeks. A large baseline to 12-week change was observed for the incremental shuttle walk test. The exercise group at 24 weeks recorded an overall mean improvement of 143 plus or minus 86 meters, and the control group recorded a reduction of 32 plus or minus 75 meters. Findings show a 5.6 kilogram difference between groups in body mass change from baseline to 24 weeks, favoring the exercise group. So this results example gave a brief summary of the key results. I mentioned key results there. I've used the primary outcome and body mass outcome that are of interest and of significance here. I've saved the secondary results for the poster or oral presentation, and sometimes it is useful in the results section to add any adverse events. And this section totaled 95 words. So finally, the conclusion. It is really key, as David said, to report the study's overall take-home message and leave the reviewer wanting to hear more. So here's my example of the conclusion. A 12-week supervised exercise intervention led to significant improvements in body mass and functional walking ability post-intervention, with further improvements at the 24-week follow-up. This study highlights the importance of physical activity after metabolic bariatric surgery, particularly at the typical point of recurrent weight gain. So I've tried to ensure I leave the reviewer wanting to hear more. I have tied the conclusion to a clinical audience, because it's all well and good giving a conclusion, but if the reader doesn't understand the application of that, it's not very helpful, especially as people attending IFSO are often clinical experts. I've also ensured here to use the correct and appropriate language, as mentioned in my previous slides, and this example totaled 44 words in the conclusion. And I just thought I'd put the whole abstract together on one page, and the total word count for the abstract that I just presented to you was 295 words. And as you will have heard David mention earlier, there is a word count of 350, but if you can keep it less than that, amazing. It's the more concise, the better. So I've just copied the link across again and copied the closing date for the abstract submissions for IFSO. Thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to our discussions around abstracts.
Thanks to David and Louisa for their excellent presentations. We've already received several comments that people appreciated the clear examples. And we have one question so far. I think it's a great one. I'm going to open it up to both David and Louisa. So given the global anti-obesity medication shortages, followed by subsequent ad hoc supplies, data sets will be affected. This then affects quality of statistical analysis and may make the data seem less relevant or impressive. How do you navigate such challenges? Simple question for both of you.
I'm probably less worried about this than the individual who posed the question. I think there's so much enthusiasm and so many unanswered questions around the use of anti-obesity medications that while we're facing all of these challenges, we know there are issues not only with supply chains and so forth, but We know that long-term adherence to the medications are going to be an issue we're going to deal with for years to come. I think I think it's, for a meeting like this, I think it's going to be a non-issue. And I think that, I think also this is where, those of us who went through statistical training when we were in graduate school have come to realize that our card-carrying biostatisticians are usually on the cutting edge of coming up with analytic plans that can really help us answer challenging questions like this. So if I put my reviewer hat on, it's not something I'd be particularly worried about.
Louisa, do you have anything to add?
To be honest, I think David's given a great answer to that one. But I would say if you have any words available in the abstract, limitations can be included. So if it's something that you think is key to the study that you're presenting, it can be included in the abstract, is what I would say.
We have another great question. What is the difference between an abstract for a conference and an abstract for a journal?
So I think this is really important, actually, because journal abstracts are presented to journal editors along with the article concerned. And typically the editors or reviewers are familiar with that research area. And conference abstracts are presented alone to conference organisers or others who may be reviewing the abstracts, may not have those expertise in that area. So this means that particularly for conference abstracts, it's even more important to submit a clear and concise abstract with no jargon. Journal editors or peer reviewers can suggest edits for journal abstracts, whereas conference organisers or whoever's reviewing the abstracts for conferences cannot. So it's more likely to not be accepted. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that's a great response. I hope that's informative. Several people actually asked that question. Both of you are probably likely to be reviewers for IFSO abstracts this year. So what do you think would be your #1 abstract don't? As you mentioned, David, that reviewers are going to be reviewing probably maybe even 20 abstracts, at least 10 abstracts. So what is the #1 don't that would kind of set you off when you're reviewing an abstract?
If I had to pick one, it'd be use of the term morbid obesity.
Okay. So proper terminology. Louisa?
I was going to say not using person first language too, but I would probably say one of the most frustrating things is not following the guidelines that have been set by that conference. So there's quite a few that I would say, but that's probably the next one.
Louisa, someone has a specific question for you. Any general tips for someone who's just getting started? What to look out for when beginning to write abstracts?
I think it's making sure that you've got a clear rationale and methodically approach the writing of an abstract. So making sure each element that we discussed in our presentations is included, and to make sure that you don't put too much detail in, but a sufficient amount of information to get the importance of your research across. And making sure that you've got a good conclusion that leads someone to wanting to hear more and invite you to present a poster or an oral presentation at the conference.
Would both of you also recommend having someone, particularly who's more experienced, proofread abstracts if they have access to someone who can do that?
Yes, definitely. And also I would say to take time to write it. Don't leave it to the last minute, because you can often tell when an abstract has been rushed and pulled together in a day or so.
Yeah, that's another great point, giving adequate time. What is, when we think about aspects of abstracts that, both of you talked about kind of leaving the reader wanting more, but also like in terms of the background, having the reader kind of look forward to what's coming next in the subsequent sections. How do we kind of help writers emphasize significance? So we talked about some key points. One was that, letting them know it's a significant problem, and not just obesity generally, but what you're studying is a significant problem. From a methodological standpoint, can we also talk about significance in that way? So if someone's using a new technique or a new measure, would that be considered something that you would include in the background as well?
I would say it could, but I think one thing, back to your question before, of I wouldn't put this at the top of my don't do or things that would frustrate me as a reviewer. But if you're going to make the case that you want to study construct X, you need to make sure that it's not that it's tied to where the literature is right now. This is the challenge I think we see an awful lot with the trainees, whether they're students or so forth, and that they come up with a wonderful idea and they say kind of, over a cup of coffee one morning, or, they say, boy, I wonder if there's a relationship between A and B. And they haven't necessarily made the case that if the literature is over at A, what is the ultimate connection to B? Otherwise, it seems like the proverbial fishing expedition. So I think in those cases where you're trying to make the argument that the field should use a different measure or go in a different direction, you need to spend more, maybe an additional sentence in the background making the case of why you think this is important. Because otherwise, if the relationship between A and B is so far afield, it may end up being less compelling. Give me a reason as a reviewer to help me understand why you think these two things are connected or related.
So one of the things I keep coming back to, and I think it's a great kind of take home with the conclusion, is leaving the reader wanting more. But sometimes we can make conclusions that are not supported by our data or our design. So can one of you or both of you maybe give an example just of how that might occur, just to give our viewers and our abstract writers an example of what not to do?
Louisa, why don't you go first? If you've got one, I've got an example of that just popped into my head, which I'm happy to share. But if you want to
go
go
for it first.
Okay. It almost, from my perspective, Dale, it almost gets back to a wording issue. So it's like, the list of phrases we should stay away from. Something that I was actually just talking about with my students last night. Be really, really, as a reader, I get very skeptical very quickly when I see people using the words cause or proof. And that, I think, is a signal in some ways that you have wandered away from the statistical analysis that you've done, because as many of us know and appreciate, it is really, really difficult to make a compelling case that A causes B or that this study proves this. Science more often than not does not work that way, unfortunately. It'd be great if it did. And so we need to be really careful of that. So when people start using terms like that, I start to wonder, do they really understand what their analytic approach was intended to do? I probably, Dale, to be candid, I probably would worry about that a little bit less for a conference abstract. I would really be concerned about it if I'm reviewing a manuscript for a journal.
I think for me, it's making definitive conclusions when, say, for instance, you've got a very small sample size and big standard deviations within your results, and it may show that there could be an effect of a certain information, a certain intervention on an outcome. It's when people conclude that the terminology is very important, because something like this could show a significant impact if, so for instance, an exercise intervention 12 to 24 weeks after bariatric surgery could be beneficial for weight loss or weight maintenance. But if that is said too definitively, do you see where I'm trying to come from? It's basically saying this could have an impact, rather than this definitely has an impact, when you haven't done the necessary analysis on the large sample that you would need to make those definitive conclusions.
So what I hear you saying, Louisa, is that you can stretch it a bit and say, like, there's potential for this to happen, but should not say this will happen, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So in terms of kind of just softening how we approach our conclusions. Dr. Himpens actually has a great suggestion, and I think it would almost it's almost representing what David had in his slide. So Dr. Himpens says, I think it would be a good idea to provide the organizers the most used non-first person terms on top of the abstract form to make sure the abstract will not use inappropriate language. The term obesity surgery came up in 7 of 15 abstracts that he recently reviewed for an IFSO EC Congress. So I think your slide is particularly useful, David, in terms of appropriate terms versus inappropriate terms.
Yeah, and there is a big table in the guidelines that goes through this, and again, it was informative to me, because I still am, I'm still making sure that I'm as careful as I can be with my language. I still make the occasional mistake, and not as careful and thoughtful, and also, the field's also evolving, and that, for those of us who've been at this for a while, it's moving to metabolic and bariatric surgery is new, and we need to, it takes those of us of a certain age to kind of catch up and to adjust to the new ways of the world, and the new ways that we're using the most appropriate and respectful language.
I think it's also key on that point to, if you are submitting an abstract or a journal article, to make sure that you have looked at what the most appropriate language is, given how fast the research area is moving to.
And Luis, I actually want to go back to a point that you made a few moments ago about, somebody writing their first abstract or just getting started. I completely agree that having somebody who's done it before spend a couple of minutes reading your work. We're, as you and I both demonstrated, kind of remarkably so, you can write these things in about 290 words. It's kind of funny to see that we ended up, both of our examples ended up 3 words apart. But so that doesn't take a lot of time for somebody to read. And so, go find a trusted colleague, find somebody who's presented at IFSO before, ask them to do you a favor, maybe you buy them a cup of coffee as a thank you. But that can save you a lot of aggravation and frustration, and probably also in some ways increase the odds that your abstract will be accepted and that you can attend the meeting.
And I guess on that point, David, it's important that you have all of the authors review the abstract too. Make sure, hopefully some more of the authors may have that little added experience in there as well. But yeah, that's a key. And I think you mentioned that in your presentation, David, about all of the authors reviewing abstracts before they're submitted.
And Louisa, then I would also go back to your point, is that if you're going to ask a senior colleague to review your work, you should also afford them sufficient time to do so. So I think we've addressed all of our questions. I'd just like to, what would be each of your take-home points? What would be, if you could, in one sentence, what would be your recommendation to people submitting abstracts this year in terms of trying to, as you said, David, increase the odds that they're accepted and featured?
Louisa, I'll defer to you.
I think what I would say the take home is, for your abstract, make sure you've got a clear, catchy title, short background, clear objectives, a clear, concise methodology with not too much detail. In the results, make sure you actually answer that objective that you've stated in the first part of the abstract, and give us a bit of an evidence-based discussion point. And make sure that you leave the reviewer wanting to hear more, because ultimately that'll get you the successful application, the successful abstract.
David, anything you can add to that?
I'm going to be pithy and succinct. Less is more. Remember that you can't cram everything into 350 words. Resist that temptation to try to tell us every nuance about the study, and that concise, to the point, discreet is the way to go. So less is more. As much as you want to leave us as reviewers with a favorable impression, too many bells and whistles, too much going on, too busy of an abstract will end up frustrating us. So less is more is probably the strategy. So, listen to your better angels when you start thinking about how much, this is the greatest study of all time is not something that we want to hear.
Well, I want to thank David and Louisa for their excellent presentations and this question and answer period, and IFSO for supporting this, and the IFSO Research Innovation Committee of Integrated Health. And just a couple of reminders, if you weren't able to take notes, that this webinar was recorded. It's going to be available tomorrow on the IFSO Virtual Academy and the YouTube channel. And with that, we look forward to seeing everybody in Melbourne. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.